All right, let's jump right into this explainer with a claim that honestly sounds completely backward. Natural resource wealth can actually make countries poorer, not richer. I know at first glance that idea sounds entirely wrong. We're completely conditioned to think that unearthing immense natural wealth is the ultimate economic shortcut. But today, we're going to dismantle that assumption piece by piece and uncover the hidden mechanics of global wealth.
Because you'd think discovering oil, copper, or diamonds is like hitting the jackpot, right? The expectation is that money just flows in, GDP rises, and the whole nation prospers. But wait, that doesn't make sense when we look at the reality. Structurally, it is often a curse. Instead of progress, so many resource-rich nations experience stunted growth, deep inequality, and instability. We really need to understand why this happens, because it's definitely not a coincidence. It is a highly predictable pattern.
So we're going to treat this explainer almost like a step-by-step case study for policy students. We'll be walking through 1. The resource wealth paradox, 2. Economic distortion and Dutch disease, 3. Political decay and rentier states, 4. Boom and bust volatility, 5. Extreme conflict, and finally 6. How the system dictates the future.
Let's start with part 1, the resource wealth paradox, focusing on the system over the symptoms. The problem we're going to uncover isn't the physical resource itself, but how a country's entire system reacts to its sudden discovery.
And that brings us to our absolute core theme. We have to stop looking at the resource curse as something accidental or mysterious. The problem is not the resource, it's how the system reacts to it. When sudden, massive wealth from a single commodity enters an economy, it fundamentally rewrites the rules of that society. It changes how money moves, how leaders govern, and how citizens work. It's highly structural and, unfortunately, predictably devastating if the right safeguards aren't in place.
Which leads us into part 2, economic distortion, and a concept known as Dutch disease.
We begin this first pathology by looking at the pure economics. The term Dutch disease actually comes from the Netherlands in the 1970s after they discovered natural gas. Here's how the mechanics play out. When a country exports massive amounts of natural resources, it earns a ton of foreign currency. This huge influx pushes up the value of their local currency. Now, you might think a strong currency is great, but when resource exports strengthen the local currency, it actually hurts local manufacturing and farming. Why? Because that stronger currency makes those other exports way too expensive for the rest of the world to buy, making them entirely uncompetitive. More exports literally leads to a weaker local economy elsewhere.
Let's look at a concrete example. In Nigeria, over 80% of their exports are tied solely to crude oil. Back in the 1960s, Nigeria actually had a really diverse economic base. They were producing agricultural goods like cocoa and palm oil alongside light manufacturing. But when the massive oil boom hit in the 1970s, the entire economy shifted focus, largely abandoning those diverse sectors.
The reality is painfully clear when you look at that export concentration. Instead of building a diversified economy with a wide array of industries, the country becomes trapped in an unhealthy dependence on just one single sector. The manufacturing and agriculture sectors shrink, and the millions of everyday jobs they could have provided just vanish.
And the human cost of that shift is staggering. Based on ILOstat data for Nigeria, we see a composite rate of labor underutilization at 11.6% and formal unemployment at 3.5%. Failing to diversify jobs prevents sustainable economic growth. You see, extractive industries like oil drilling are super capital intensive. They require expensive machinery, but they are not labor intensive. They just don't employ the masses. This leads to high youth unemployment and severe labor underutilization that actively worsens the resource curse, leaving the broader population in poverty while the national GDP technically goes up.
Now, let's look at part 3, political decay and the rise of rentier states. Because economic distortion is only part of the story, we have to look at how this sudden wealth completely warps political behavior, creating what's called a rentier state. When governments rely heavily on resource revenue, often referred to as rents, instead of taxing their citizens, a very dangerous disconnect forms. In a normal economy, a government literally has to build infrastructure and educate its workforce so citizens can earn income, which the government then taxes to survive. But with natural resources, the government just gets its paycheck directly from foreign oil or mining companies.
So the crucial takeaway here is that in states lacking strong pre-existing institutions, natural resources breed massive corruption and elite capture instead of public investment. The wealth is just shifted out of productive activity and into unproductive rent-seeking. We see this acutely in places like Equatorial Guinea.
Despite immense oil wealth generating one of the highest GDPs per capita in Africa, the vast majority of the population remains in deep poverty while a tiny elite captures the state's rents. The sheer scale of the wealth makes the state itself a prize to be captured.
And this is exactly why the system decays. The ruling elites simply do not need the population's economic productivity to maintain their own power and wealth. Accountability completely vanishes. The government's priority shifts from developing the nation to just maintaining control over the resource spigot. If governments don't need citizens, they don't serve citizens.
I want you to take a second to really let that sink in. This right here is the true aha moment of our explainer. The issue is not that resources exist. The issue is how they reshape the economy and incentives. The physical oil or copper isn't evil. The crisis stems from how sudden, unearned wealth completely warps the incentive structures of both the economy and the political leadership. Again, this is a pattern, not a coincidence.
Moving on to Part 4, Volatility, or the classic boom and bust cycle.
When an entire nation's budget is tied to an incredibly unstable global commodity, things get chaotic. Just think about Chad's erratic revenue timeline over the years. Imagine trying to run a stable government, build long-term infrastructure, or fund a national education system with this kind of massive financial whiplash. Resource prices rise and fall dramatically based on global markets that are completely out of a country's control.
This creates a vicious commodity cycle. When prices are high, governments spend aggressively, taking on massive long-term commitments. But when prices eventually fall, revenues collapse, leading to a total systemic crisis. Take Venezuela, for example. They spent wildly during their oil boom. But when the price of oil dropped, they faced a complete economic meltdown because they lacked any economic diversification to fall back on. When prices fall, the entire economy collapses.
Let's look at Part 5, Extreme Outcomes, where resources end up fueling conflict.
The high concentration of valuable, easy-to-extract point source minerals like cobalt is incredibly dangerous. Because these resources are immensely valuable and relatively easy to smuggle, they provide a direct funding source for armed rebel groups. They can be looted or taxed by militias, completely bypassing the formal state apparatus and sustaining illicit war economies.
So ultimately, resources can fuel conflict instead of development. In places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, resources like cobalt and coltan, the very materials that power our modern smartphones and electric vehicles, have fueled and prolonged armed conflict for nearly 3 decades. Rather than driving development, this wealth creates relentless, violent competition, trapping generations in a cycle of poverty.
Finally, Part 6. The system dictates the future. But hey, here is the good news. The resource curse is a pattern, but it is absolutely not an inevitable fate. We've uncovered the hidden system, but we can also see how it can be successfully challenged.
Norway is the perfect contrasting case. They proved that with strict accountability, a diversified economy, and a robust sovereign wealth fund, you can experience the exact same resource discovery but achieve a completely different outcome. When they found oil in the North Sea, they didn't let it distort their economy. Same resource, different system, different outcome.
It's all about whether a country has what economists call grabber-friendly or producer-friendly institutions to handle the sudden influx of wealth. Natural resources do not determine a country's future. Control, institutions, and incentives do.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to look at every global resource headline through this new lens. A massive discovery of oil or lithium is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a massive institutional stress test. So I leave you with this final, vital thought. Don't ask what a country has. Ask who controls it and who captures the value.